The other day, I went to the store looking for cheese. And I got to the big refrigerated cheese aisle. I'm looking at all of this. I'm like, oh my goodness, you people want an arm and a leg for cheese now. The price is skyrocketing. And I'm sitting there thinking about whether or not I'm prepared to make a cheese investment at this point, when out of the corner of my eye, something catches my attention. There's this whole stack of unrefrigerated bricks of basically cheese for $7.99 a pop. 32-ounce block of cheese, basically, for $7.99. I look back over here, and I'm like, this cheese over here in the refrigerator is for suckers. You get way less cheese, and you got to pay way more money. I'm going to go with the basically cheese for $7.99. So I bring it home because I got a hankering for cheese, and I pop the thing open, and I would like to share some of my observations with you. One of the first things I noticed is that this basically cheese has a color that I could imagine actual cheese being. The second thing I noticed is that it moves in a way that I could hypothetically see cheese moving like at a certain temperature and under certain atmospheric conditions. There are aspects that could be construed as cheese-like as you smell it and eat it. Pretty good. If I am to be completely honest, I would, after investigating, have to acknowledge that this pasteurized recipe cheese-like product really is substantially different than other cheeses I've experienced in my life, but it sort of halfway ticks a few of the boxes of cheese, enough that you could maybe fool somebody for a minute. Likewise, in the time of Jesus, in the 1st century AD, you had this concept of the Messiah. This is the Jewish notion that there was going to be some long-awaited king who would show up, descended from David. He would reign on David's throne, and he would restore Israel and straighten everything out that was weird and busted up and broken. And unsurprisingly, a title that has that much promise, and with it maybe even that much power, money, or women might come with it. There were a lot of people who had elements that looked Messiah-like. You could, if you looked at them in the right light for a minute, imagine them to be Messiah-ish, and they caught on for a second and they went away very quickly. Now, most of these people who claimed the Messiah thing explicitly or implicitly are forgotten to history and just mentioned in batch form by historians, but a few of them we actually know by name. And so what I want to do in this video is look at these rival imitation, basically messiahs that cropped up around the time of the most famous of all of the messianic claimants, that being Jesus of Nazareth. And I think when we get a sense of all of these different claimants and what they had in common and how they differed from Jesus, we will have a little different understanding of why Jesus stood out and had stood the test of time. And we'll have a little better understanding of why some of the stories of Jesus in the Gospels in the New Testament read the way they do. All right, I'm going to leave that sitting right there and try not to smell it. We're going to talk about rival, basically messianic claimants from the 1st century. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour. Here we go. I'm not joking around. I was going to do this little not that funny shtick where I took one bite of this for each segment that we did, and then I'd be chomping on it and be like, oh, like it's basically cheese, and these are basically messiahs. I took one bite on that last cut, and I cannot do this. Just imagine I'm eating it, and it's funny, and it's somehow helpful for keeping track of what's going on. There's this guy named Josephus who wrote these 2 books. One of them is called Antiquities of the Jews. There's Josephus. He's a Jewish 1st century historian who writes from a very Roman sympathetic perspective. And he, in particular, in chapter 10 of book 17 of the Antiquities of the Jews, he writes about this moment in history right at the end of Herod the Great's life. Herod the Great was an ethnarch, like a Roman-controlled puppet king of Galilee, Judea, the whole area that comes up in the New Testament. And he was not well liked by his subjects. He built a bunch of stuff. He got really crazy and paranoid at the end of his life. But in light of what I'm reading from Josephus here, I think his paranoia makes a little more sense, because apparently there were a ton of people who were rattling this messianic saber, breaking out this language, hinting at things to try to rally people to themselves, to get rid of Herod and to make it so that Herod's descendants would not take over the throne, and to garner for themselves some sort of power or new Israel. And because of that, Herod got weird at the end of his life. Well, Herod was weird at the end of his life for his own purposes as well. But when he died, Josephus indicates that there was not just this one little uprising or like a couple messiahs, this guy, Andy and Carl, they got worked up. Josephus indicates that people had Messiah fever. Check this out. Book 17, chapter 10, starting in line 269. Josephus writes here, "Now at this time," that's when Herod died, "there were 10,000 other disorders in Judea, which were like tumults because a great number put themselves into warlike posture." And he goes on to describe people trying to rally troops from Herod's side. He describes people burning things down, riots in the countryside, messiahs on the hills and the mountains, just everywhere. And he characterizes the Romans as being the heroes who came in and restored order. There's a reference to a guy that keeps coming up named Gratus. I don't know if this is maybe Valerius Gratus of later fame. Whatever the case, the Romans, including this Gratus fellow, they always show up and they deal with the insurrectionists and make it go away. Now, Josephus is not always employing this Messiah language when he talks about this multitude of claimants who cropped up. But what else would it be? I mean, even if somebody didn't become so bold as to claim to be the Messiah, if they had a few of the attributes that looked vaguely Messiah-ish, people were so hungry to be done with their Roman overlords, their Greek overlords, the Persian overlords from back in the past. They just wanted to be themselves, their own beautiful theocratic people like they were once. They wanted to restore Israel like the Messiah was supposed to do. That it would look like that because of that longing, they were willing to chase after, at least a little bit, anybody who hinted at the Messiah thing, even if they were obviously an imitation. Simon of Peraea, I always struggle to do this, is backwards. Peraea is on the east side, I think I got that right for you, of the Jordan River, and it would have been within the domain of the Herod family, depending on when you asked. Simon was a slave, according to Josephus, in the household of Herod. And when Herod died, he was like, why not Simon be king? The text describes him as handsome and tall and comely and influential. And so he went on some kind of burning spree. Apparently he burned a royal palace in Jericho. People rallied to him. He had different groups that were out in the wilderness supporting him, and a lot of them came from Peraea, apparently. Josephus describes them as fighting with boldness, not so much tactical brilliance or military excellence. And even though they put up a great fight, this Gratus fellow, again, it comes along and defeats them. Simon of Peraea disappears out into the wilderness, but Gratus tracks him down and takes his head. And then there's some cleanup operation for the leftover followers of this Simon guy. Now, as best as I can tell, there's no actual tangible claim of messiahship. Like, he doesn't use the words, or we don't have that on record. I mean, who knows what kinds of stuff he wrote? This was a pretty big deal. But his actions look like what people would have expected a messianic figure at the time to be, and their actions in rallying to him suggest that they viewed him in that way. Thronges, I'm not sure I'm saying that right. He was a shepherd, apparently. Josephus tells us about him as well. He had 4 brothers. They were all stout and into fighting people. And Thronges had so much success, apparently, right after the death of Herod the Great, roughly 4 BC is what we're talking about. So this is kind of ironic. A shepherd is having a messianic rebellion against Herod the Great's descendants at exactly the same time that Jesus is being born in a manger with shepherds around him, who would later be known as the Messiah. This Thronges guy, whatever the case, draws a big following. His brothers help him out as his lieutenants, and he establishes something of a kingdom. Josephus describes him as putting a diadem about his head and assembling a council to debate about what things should be done, and all things were done according to his pleasure. He's effectively a king for a period of time. And then he runs afoul of he's already afoul of the Romans. He runs into the Romans. They have battles. They fare decently, but gradually one brother at a time gets picked off. This weakens Thronges' base. And interestingly, the text doesn't actually give us any conclusion as to what happened to him, even though we do know the fate of his brothers which were all bad across the board. So Herod Archelaus, part of his story of coming to power and managing to scramble for the reins of power after the death of his father, Herod the Great, part of his story is overcoming this Athronges guy who, again, has a whole lot of the marks of basically a Messiah character. Judas the Galilean was regarded as the founder of one of the 4 philosophical sects of Judaism in the 1st century AD. 2 of these you've heard of, they come up in the Bible all the time, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The 3rd you've probably heard of because they're associated with Qumran and the Dead Sea Scrolls. These are the Essenes. And the 4th also get a little bit of mention in the New Testament, and these are the Zealots. In fact, one of Jesus' disciples was a zealot, Simon the Zealot. And the Zealots were the burn it down crowd. There's no reasoning with Rome. The taxes are too high. Their laws are awful. We just got to get rid of them by being violent and destructive and making it so expensive for them to stay here that they'll just up and leave. And so Josephus is like, well, you played your hand. You played it too far. Rome doesn't get up and leave from anywhere. And now we don't have a temple anymore. And a whole bunch of us are dead. Thanks a lot, Judas the Galilean and all your idiot followers. So understandably, Josephus' treatment of him is not super friendly in the Antiquities of the Jews here. But at the beginning of Book 18, Chapter 1, he says, there was one, Judas the Galilean, a Gaulonite, as he puts it, of a city whose name was Gamala. And he goes on to describe Judas as raging against the Roman machine. And then ultimately, and this is where it gets kind of messianic, he apparently said that, well, let me just read it to you. They also said that God would not otherwise be assisting to them other than upon their joining with one another in such counsels as might be successful. So he said, God isn't going to let us win unless we all come together to resist together. That does sound a little messianic. And geographically, he's from Galilee, and well, that's what the Old Testament points to prophetically as well. Josephus, for all of his talk about Judas the Galilean, doesn't give us a neat, tidy wrap-up as to how it all ended, but we get a little bit of a bow on it from the Bible in the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 5, 2 of these sects, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, are gathered together at the Sanhedrin to make decisions about what to do with the followers of Jesus who won't shut up about Jesus. And some people are like, oh, we should probably just kill him to make this thing go away. Obviously, if you go back and read Acts chapter 5 now, you see the Messiah claim fatigue that these religious leaders have. You're killing us. We have a sweetheart deal with the Romans. We're trying to keep things in order. We're trying to provide spiritual guidance to our people. And everybody keeps claiming to be the Messiah and throwing everything into chaos. And we can't get our facts straight. And Rome doesn't like us. And you're making things very, very difficult. So they don't want to hear any more about messiahs. They just got crucified, the most difficult, stubborn Messiah they've dealt with yet, even though he wasn't militaristic. That's Jesus. And now these guys won't shut up about him. And so this dude Gamaliel comes forward. He's like the wise old leader of this group. And he's like, all right, let's think about this Messiah thing before we go around throwing rocks at people or executing anybody. And so he addresses them in verse 35 of Acts 5. He says, men of Israel, consider carefully what you intend to do to these men being the disciples of Jesus. He says, some time ago, Theudas appeared claiming to be somebody, and about 400 men rallied to him, and he was killed, and all his followers were dispersed, and all came to nothing. After him, Judas the Galilean appeared in the days of the census and led a band of people in revolt. He too was killed, and all of his followers were scattered. And of course, the reasoning goes that, hey, those guys clearly weren't from God, or we wouldn't have been able to kill it. We killed it, and they went away. But in this situation, I don't know if this one actually is from God. I mean, I think what he's suggesting is this has more of the marks of the actual cheese than all of these other things did. Then if we kill these guys, we may find ourselves fighting against God. Let's just see. I mean, the leader is already executed. Let's just see if it dies out. If it doesn't, maybe there's actually some legitimacy to Jesus' messianic claim. It's a pretty interesting passage, I think. But it does put a bow on the Judas the Galilean thing, and it brings up a name that we need to talk about next. Theudas, the guy I just mentioned, the next rival messianic sort of claimant here, is a tricky one to talk about because there's some question as to whether we're talking about one guy or 2 separate guys here. Theudas is not that abnormal a name, and it might even be some sort of adopted name or title if you break the name down. We get two accounts of this guy that don't neatly line up. Now, one of these accounts is in Josephus, book 20, chapter 5, where quickly he mentions the guy saying, "Now it came to pass while Theudas was procurator of Judea that a certain magician, whose name was Theudas, persuaded a great part of the people to take their effects with them and follow him to the river Jordan, for he told them he was a prophet, and that he would, by his own command, divide the river and afford them an easy passage over it." It's interesting because there's a later messianic claimant named Moses of Crete, and this is like in the 5th century, so we're not going to talk much about him, who also tried to duplicate the parting of the seas miracle, whether it's the parting of the Red Sea or the parting of the Jordan River on the way in for the conquest. And I think he's walked into the water and drowned along with a bunch of his followers. So those miracles didn't seem to ever work out. At any rate, it says, "And many were deluded by his words. However, Theudas did not permit them to make any advantage of his wild attempt, but sent a troop of horsemen out against them, who falling upon them unexpectedly slew many of them and took many of them alive. And they cut off Theudas' head and carried it to Jerusalem." And that was that. So we get that account of Theudas, which would seem to correspond to a little bit later time. We're talking about 45-ish AD based on the context clues from Josephus here. But the tricky thing about the name Theudas is that in Acts chapter 5, where we just talked about Gamaliel mentioning to the Sanhedrin two names, Judas the Galilean, who obviously must have thought of himself in a messianic sense, or it wouldn't have made sense for Gamaliel to bring him up, and Theudas, who must have thought of himself the same way. Gamaliel brings these two guys up, but this conversation where Gamaliel brings up Theudas predates what Josephus is telling about with the Jordan River and the horsemen and the beheading and all of that. It predates it by more than a decade. So that's tricky. Now, some people look at this and they're like, well, the most obvious solution is that Luke, who wrote the book of Acts, just made a mistake, didn't have his facts straight, and there's an anachronism here, and it's not possible that Gamaliel could have been talking about this because it hadn't happened yet. Another possibility is what I was hinting at a minute ago. You just got a lot of people who went by this name. The name kind of works as a title, and so it's possible that the Theudas of Acts chapter 5 is somebody from those 10,000 revolts that Josephus mentioned. I mean, if you're talking about 10,000 revolutionaries within living memory of Gamaliel saying these words, it's not that crazy that another one of them would have been named Theudas and would have had, some purchase that he gained doing what he did. So it's possible that this reference to Theudas in Acts chapter 5 is the only reference to this character that we have in all of history, and that Josephus is referencing a different Theudas. I think any fair thinker has to acknowledge that even though this is not what I believe, that maybe Luke just didn't get his facts straight. One way or another, we get the specific account about a guy who we know from history went and pulled these messianic shenanigans and got beheaded as a result, and another guy who may be the same guy, but I think more likely is someone entirely different. And part of the reason I think that is that Luke's book had to pass the living memory test with his audience. And if there was nobody named Theudas, people would have caught that and been like, oh, we need to fix this real quick so our book doesn't look stupid. Because if that glaring chronological error is left there, people won't believe in our God and they won't think this is true. So from a theistic or non-theistic perspective, I think it makes the most sense that we're talking about two different characters here. Finally, I want to quickly mention three unnamed messianic-ish characters who show up who I think merit at least getting into the conversation. One is a dude we learn about in book 18 of the Antiquities. This is a Samaritan prophet who believes that he's going to rally a bunch of people to his side and go up Mount Gerizim. He has his people arm themselves. They're going to go dig up some vessels that Moses buried up there, apparently. But Pontius Pilate gets wind of it, and he'll have none of it. So he sends out troops. It's not supposed to turn violent, but it does turn violent. It's a black eye for Pontius Pilate. This one's a little different because it looks like this is born out of a Samaritan notion of the Messiah. but it would contribute to the messianic claimant fatigue that we've been talking about throughout our conversation. The second of these unnamed prophets is one that literally just is called the unnamed prophet. He gets mentioned in book 20 of the Antiquities, and it looks like this is something that got stomped out by the governor Festus very quickly, but this dude was fashioning himself in the style of Moses, and again, making claims that pointed toward Messiah-ish things enough that the government felt they needed to get involved to get this thing shut down quickly. The third is a character called the Egyptian prophet, who rallied a ton of people, like 30,000 maybe, marched on Jerusalem. He told his followers, when we get there, much like Joshua with Jericho, the walls are going to come tumbling down. I will ascend to the Mount of Olives. The walls did not tumble down. He did not ascend to the Mount of Olives. A bunch of them got killed. He fled, and we never hear from him again. So now we get to the bajillion-dollar question anytime we talk about history, and that is, why does any of this stuff matter? Well, one, it's fun. It's people. They did things. There's intrigue here, so that's great. A little bit more importantly, two, it helps us understand the historical backdrop of one of the most important moments in all of history, whether you are a theist or otherwise. You got to admit, this first century Jewish stuff casts a very long shadow over all of history, for better or for worse. The New Testament casts a very long shadow. And if you have no context for what people thought about Messiah at that point, it reads a lot differently than it does if you do have a context for it. So imagine for a minute that we pick up the New Testament out of a vacuum, and what we see here is a bunch of people who are just irrationally obsessed with this Messiah thing and get irrationally angry really, really fast over what seems like innocuous claims. Jesus heals somebody on the Sabbath. He does this or that with paying the temple tax. He makes this remark or reads from that scroll or says this thing is fulfilled, and people lose their gourds. Why? Well, because now we know there was messianic fatigue. Everybody claimed this. It was tired. It was played out. It looked like everything you could do with the Messiah motif had already been done. Really? Oh, let me guess. You're going to gather some people together and go kill some people and say that you're the chosen one? Oh, wonderful. Please, let's do more of that. We know that what Rome wanted from their client king states was just to be left alone. Collect the taxes and don't have rebellions. You know who was the worst at being controlled in that regard of all of the client king states? It was Judea. It was Galilee. They were a pain in the butt for Rome. And so you have all of these client rulers whose wealth, whose prestige, whose future prospects of power, whose prospects of climbing the political ladder all hinge on the good favors of Rome. And Rome is not very impressed when they can't keep their people in line. So messiahs just aren't helpful. It's not worth the risk. The proposition is a dumb one. We tried the Messiah solution to Rome. It has failed literally 10,000 times, guys. So now along comes this, and I guess we're getting into reason number 3 of why this matters. So now along comes this Jesus guy, and people are like, no, come on. Are you idiots really falling for this again? Please, no. This isn't how messiahs work. This isn't it, but people still wanted that revolutionary leader. So they wanted Jesus to work out. So people flock to the countryside to go see what the deal is with him. And they don't get what they expected. They get somebody who, unlike this thing's failure to tick all of the boxes of what is cheese, they get something that succeeds in ticking all of the boxes of what is Messiah. Jesus is from the right place. He's born the right way. He says the right stuff. He lives the right kind of life. He's able to do the stuff that he's supposed to be able to do. If he's the Messiah, he completes all of the incomplete arcs that are lobbed forward into history by the Old Testament. He rounds out all of the thematic elements of the Old Testament, and he doesn't kill anybody. In fact, when people go to kill people on his behalf, he's like, no, we're not doing that. And when somebody actually even swings a sword to try to murder somebody on his behalf, he's like, no, I'm putting that guy's ear back on. No cutting off ears or killing of any kind. We ain't doing it. Jesus is a completely different version of the Messiah. So this third reason of why this matters is huge. Whether you just like history or whether you're a really big fan of Jesus and the Bible, it's huge. Think about how weird it would be to have 10,000 archetypes, 10,000 samples of a thing come and go, and they wear the same outfits, and they say the same words, and they do the same stuff, and it's all so pedestrian. And then somebody comes along and does it all different. Like, imagine if a rock star came along right now who did rock star in a way that wasn't even close to how anybody else has ever done it. It seems like that's a pretty played out genre, doesn't it? Like, we know how it works. We know the legends and the stories of rock stars. What would it even look like? I can't even imagine what it would look like to be a starkly different rock star at this point. Yeah, we've had about 10,000 of those. So I suppose the comparison holds. Yet Jesus somehow defies all the expectations in a way that is gentle and beautiful and attractive and lasting. He passes the Gamaliel test we talked about in Acts chapter 5. He somehow emerges from this incredibly crowded bracket of messianic claimants as the one. And look, again, respectfully, wherever you're at, whatever you believe, first, thanks for being here and for being up for the conversation. Two, we all got to admit, this is the one that stuck. This is the one you've heard of. And why? Well, I think it comes back to the cheese. Because again, all of these other things had parallel, similar-ish elements that vaguely resembled, on like 1 out of 100 features, messiahship. Jesus was 100 for 100. Everything about what he did resembled messiahship, and a whole lot of people, both then and through the ages and now, are convinced that that's in fact exactly who he was, the one true and actual claimant to this position. And I think learning more about the other claimants only makes it more evident why Jesus is the one who stuck and emerges as the winner. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour. Let's do this again soon.